Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome Anura De Alwis here at our Candid Conversation Ecosystem series at Startup Genome. Anura joining us today is the Chief Digital Economy Officer at Sri Lanka's ICTA. That's the government agency driving the digital economy. Anura, why don't you introduce yourself and ICTA very briefly?
Thank you so much, Stephen. So very good morning, afternoon, wherever the time zone you are in. Yes, I'm Anura De Alwis, heading the digital economy of the ICTA of Sri Lanka, which is actually the apex driving the national transformation. My role has areas, about 5 areas, Stephen. One is the technology industry development that focuses on building the industry and bring the foreign direct investment to the country and develop the export market. The second piece of that is the most crucial one for today's discussion, which is the startup ecosystem development. That has development of ecosystem, the funding, seed funding mechanism, hatching, incubating, investor bringing to the startups, and finally to the exit stage, hand holding throughout the journey. The third piece of thing coming under me is the technology diffusion. That is basically taking into technology into the non-technology, traditionally non-technology industries. For example, how does technology can be used in agriculture or fisheries or tourism or health, likewise. So it's taking that technology to the non-technology traditional businesses. The fourth piece that's come under me is the capacity building that focuses on government as well as the technology industry, startup ecosystem capacity requirement. So building the capacity required for the country for the next 4 years. And finally, the regional development, which is actually divided country into 5 regions. And those regions have different needs, from education to SME development, to policy changes, to the infrastructure, etc. So looking at the different 5 clusters in the country, look at their policy and infrastructure needs and develop so that the industry as a whole can grow. So these are the areas comes under the digital economy of Sri Lanka. Of course, there is another pillar support me as a government, which is the fundamental piece of running business. So that will be outside my scope, but they'll very collaboratively working with me. On the other hand, we have the digital law pillar, which is also working very connected with me, very closely with me to support the digital economy growth.
Nora, we are so glad to have you, particularly given that you have such a broad mandate. So we are not only looking at startup ecosystems, but more coming from a digital transformation of the overall Sri Lankan economy. You're looking after the more centralized parts, but also the regional development. So it's great to have you coming from such a broad perspective. We feel very honored here at Genome to have been working with you, ICTA, and the Sri Lankan startup community, more particularly during our assessment and strategy discussions, which we jointly had with your teams in 2020 and 2021. And we were specifically looking at taking the startup community even further than it already has developed in Sri Lanka at this point. When we look at the digital economy and startups in particular in Sri Lanka, I mean, you're already ranking amongst the top 20 most innovative places in Asia. I've seen, I hope the numbers are correct, about 5% of Sri Lankan GDP is already part of the digital economy, not necessarily the startup economy only, but the digital economy, which is a fairly high percentage. And looking at trends more globally, the pandemic, similarly to other places in the world, certainly my assumption has accelerated digital transformation of any sorts. How do you see the digital economy overall develop with a view to the next 3, 4, 5 years? Is it going to grow even more substantially? Is it following the growth trajectory you've seen over the last 1 or 2 years? What's going to happen?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic question, Stephen, and I really like, because it's an eye-opener for the rest of the world as well who are watching. So I will take the question in at least 2 directions. One being the industry as a whole, the other one is the component of digital activities in the country. So the first part is actually the export. So we are right now looking at about, in the estimates of 2020, as an industry, we stood at 1.2 billion, around 1.2 billion, a purely export market IT services business and also product business. That had about high-end engineering, nearly 35% of the revenue coming from high-end engineering. Now, when you look at the goal that we are driving the country towards 2024, we are looking at 3 billion to 5 billion range dollars. Now, in that, we are not only looking at a jump, Stephen, we are also looking at basically turning the pyramid upside down, which means from 35% of the high-end engineering / IP building to a 60%. There are reasons for doing that. Number one is a country with 22 million population. We are not going to compete with countries that has 1,000 billion population because you are not, its economies of scale, everything is not going to be there if you do that. Number one. Number two is because we have been identified very successful over the years, Stephen, coming from a small kind of, IT development services organizations to high-end product captives like Pearson, which I headed before this job, 3 years ago. Then the IFS. Then we talk about Wiley Education, likes of big MNCs and HCL now in Sri Lanka. So we want to turn that also from 35% to 60% when we grow from 3 to 5 billion business. That's one side of the coin. The other side is that you talked about digital, the percentage. So percentage of the digital economy contributing to the gross domestic product today stands at 4.37, which we did this year for the first time using IMF guidelines. Now, what it means is compared to a country like America, America probably at about 12-15% closely. When you look at any tiger economies, they are between 8 to 12%. You go to a country like China, it is above 35%. So comparatively, we are low. But as a developing country, when you set the target, I think we are, I wouldn't say great, but quite okay. But when we go towards the 3 billion to 5 billion goal, not only the export, we also have a target going towards 15% of the economy on digital, which means the banks, the social life, day-to-day transaction of whether you're individual or business, to increase from 4.3 or like you said, approximately 5%, threefold. So to do that, we also have initiatives and effort put in place to convert both the government to be the digitally friendly government, which means the laws and operating mechanism to be more digital oriented, plus change the laws and the business environment also to face these challenges and make towards that, so that our digital economic contribution to the GDP will also go so that. So the reason I mentioned both is, Stephen, it's not just a revenue goal, but also converting everyone's lifestyle into that. I hope I gave both perspectives.
That makes perfect sense. And as you know, Anura, I'm sitting here in the UK, and we've probably reached about 10 to 12% of overall GDP and job creation. And you can see, even as a citizen, you can see the positive effects. All of a sudden, your transport infrastructure gets better because it gets more seamless, etc., etc. Education gets better because it is more digitalized, etc. So you see the broader effects, and that's great to hear. You mentioned a number of large corporations, companies you've been involved with, and that you try to attract to Sri Lanka. What I would like to explore a little bit with you, and what we've seen in many places all over the world, is the role of the startup community in assisting and driving, assisting, supporting this larger digital transformation, including for larger corporations, for SMEs, for the government, etc. So how do you see, how important is the role of the startup community that you have been creating and are fostering to help drive the overall digital transformation in Sri Lanka?
It's the most crucial one. If you look at the developing countries, forget about the developed countries like you, but if you consider all the developing countries, Stephen, you can see the crux of the finance or the economy depends on the SME success, because SMEs have the highest growth potential. They're lean in structure. They're adopting very fast technology and the business environment. So taking that as a key point, I mean, you can call it like startups also in the SME category, right? Mm-hmm. So that would say that if we can bring a few startups to be successful, and then if we can create few unicorns from that, the economies like us will become really, really fascinatedly successful. So to do that, that is our goal, right? So to your question, how important is the highest important? The government as a state body, as well as the government, all of us realize that if there is something that we should invest here, it should be a few areas. I mean, everyone knows number one being telco and infrastructure, because without that, because country itself, some of the companies grown in Sri Lanka 40% exponential growth during last 1.5 years. So that's telco is the demanding thing. And the second thing comes along with that is education, digital education. And I'm very proud to say that not only the startup ecosystem, but digital education policy driving also done by us. So we basically make sure that number three, from business perspective, we have to find more and more funding and create a conducive environment for those tech startups to grow. So that is the primary focus and one of the focal points, not just the government, of the private sector association, everyone. So in order to do that, Stephen, just a little bit more than your question, we have started creating, removing certain the barriers startups have, like deregulating certain things, like for example, certain things like custom laws, the tax laws, then the company registration type of rules, etc. We are changing them. So we one side engaging with the government, creating, we call it startup friendly government. That's a concept we launched about now 6 months ago, and working very hard with 14 government institutes to make these friendly for the startup ecosystem. So the reason I brought that is just to give one example how importance we have placed in our national agenda for startup, particularly techno startups.
And it is fascinating to hear how you brought together the different government departments, because too often when we look at younger activation phase ecosystems, responsibilities are a bit fragmented and you get all these frictions and barriers that still exist. It is great to hear how you come together and make this really a national priority. Right. On that note, you already, Anura, you mentioned a number of activities, strategic initiatives in funding, in education, in removing administrative barriers. We looked in our research, in our assessment for you, we looked at startup output, as we call it, the sheer number of startups. And it's kind of important that startups are experimental. Failure is part of it. So size to a degree matters. And just be interested when you look at the startup ecosystem, what are you doing to further increase the already very respectable number of startups in your ecosystem, de-risking, attracting new talent to the ecosystem to make this leap of faith on becoming an entrepreneur instead of becoming a corporate executive? Are there any particular and noteworthy activities, initiatives that you are pursuing to drive more people, to attract more people to entrepreneurship?
Absolutely, Stephen. So I will give you first a preface or a frontline statement. Now, if you look at Sri Lankan startup ecosystem, it has grown 13% this year alone. And then thanks to Genome for all the fact finding for us. And I must thank for that. And then secondly, that is valued right now at 132 million. So yeah, you can compare developed nations and say it's a very low, but as a country, 13% growth within the pandemic year, this year alone, is a huge achievement. Now, we can't stop and celebrate here, Stephen, because this is not an achievement. It's only a journey, one step of the journey. So how do we increase the numbers coming into the system is the way to increase the output, because more and more input create. So all this time we had in a 1 minute explanation, Stephen, all this time in Sri Lanka, as the apex body, we ran Spiralation, which is actually seed funding. We could seed fund every year about 20 companies. We have now seed funded over the 10 years, 100 companies, right? But we want to expand that more. Now, further, we went to the STEP program that actually start incubating and helping the companies. And even with this year, we have hired a third-party company to incubate, because when we don't have capacity, we bring external parties for assignments. Now, not only that, now we have launched recently, because when we looked at everyone focus on startup, scale up to exits, kind of. But we thought, well, there's something wrong in the pipeline. If you start with startup, you have only a little bit of numbers to deal with. But we launched this year 10,000 ideas program. We actually hired 3 to 4 organizations paid assignments to go to universities and schools and create these 10,000 ideas. So that when you create, let's say 10% of that, Stephen, we can have 1,000 easily. So that 1,000 can easily go into startup, ecosystem and get through the whole funneling. Another one we launched last week was we created an entirely free pre-startup, which means they are not startup, they are in the ideation stage, like 10,000 ideas program. They come to our lab facility downstairs, which is called Sparks, SPARX, Sparks Lab, where they will be incubated to get to a startup. So we provide entire facility, including internet, all free of charge, so long as they apply and register with us. So these are some of the programs that we have created over the many years. And I can tell you, Stephen, we had about 400 startups beginning of this year, very happily saying it's over 600 by now. Even not the year is not end. This go above and beyond the numbers we targeted for this year. Plus, we had one company in Singapore exited in Singapore 15 times the investment. So we want to get 15 or 20 of them in the next year or 2 years. So these all efforts, and we are trying to bring incubator companies externally and companies like Wadhwani Foundation from India to support our ecosystem, which is the programs that we have launched. So the number of activities we increased this year, I'm certainly saying that amount of activities sometimes not manageable within our team, but we wanted to do more, Steven, because this is do more, get them more into the system. Maybe some fail, that's okay, or more fail, that's okay, but output will be high.
That's so great to hear, because as we call it, activation phase ecosystems in our life cycle model, and Sri Lanka sits right in the middle of it, to look after this organic growth, build out this community, 10,000 ideas leading to 1,000 startups, as you put it, and you're almost approaching these numbers, is exactly the right way to go, and really to take the community with you. That leaves, obviously, and something I really want to get a little bit into detail with you, because you've created in very innovative early stage funding provision, which obviously is important if you get to, let's say, 10,000 ideas, 1,000 startups. The next question obviously is pre-seed and or early stage funding. After all, it is the lifeblood of any tech startup. And in our research, we quantified the availability and also the existing gaps in early stage capital in Sri Lanka, not uncommon in activation stage ecosystems. So we are really interested in what you're planning in terms of interventions. And in regards to that, you're breaking new ground with the alternative credit framework. We'd be really interested for others in other ecosystems to learn from your example as well. What is it? At whom do you aim it? Why did you choose to design this new funding instrument?
Fantastic question again, Stephen. So now I said the deregulation is one of the fundamental things. We went into 29 deregulations in 14 government institutes. Without that, we believe these poor startups or young startups cannot succeed. While we are doing that, we also found, Stephen, that still a developing country, the banks having a very negative look at some of the startups and scale-ups, and they believe technology. They believe because some of them don't understand, because they are traditionally happy to give loans or etc. to the traditional way of assessment. Example, long ago you need a huge like a house to get money, bond or something, versus maybe 10-15 years ago it was turned, look, if they look at your salary only, and they probably give you 15 times of your salary banks loans, or like top-up loans or anything that to do personal things or personal loans. Now it's an era that to look at complete no collateral basis. So we basically decided now it's the next, the 3.0 version of the banking system, where we should enable particularly country like us. So we work with PwC, international consulting company. We actually work with them on a pro bono assignment with them. So we looked at, and they came up with a credit scoring system. Now, who it is aimed at? It's aimed at technology startups. And then it looks at technology startups, those who do not have collateral, do not have any fixed assets. They look at the product of the company that is building, like Product Nation. The owner of the company, their credibility found. If I'm the founder, what's my credibility? What's my background? Kind of thing. And thirdly, the markets that I'm trying to go with that product. And finally, the finance, which means the audited finance for 3 years, and the predicted finance for the next 3 to 5 years. So look at those 4 areas, put a credit scoring system to say this is companies now qualified. So without collateral, country like us, we have introduced this system to nearly 10 banks. I'm very proud to say, which is about now 3 to 4 months old, maybe 5 months. And by now, it's being in onboarding stage, and one bank really went hit the nail very hard. They actually granted 4 loans by now, the value of approximately 150 million plus for 4 companies. So that was granted through this system. So the challenge is that if the companies are performing well, those granted companies, the banks will learn from that, like AI, like their neural networks start learning it. At the same time, if the banks are more and more adopting, the technology startups gets more successful. So aim is to get technology startup. Now, right now, they have given tech scale-ups. And we believe, Stephen, this alternative credit scoring system not only grow our technology startup, but also the change of the mind of traditional bankers. And I wish we pressure hard to do that.
Nora, congratulations to this new development. It reminds me of highly sophisticated credits, multidimensional credit scoring systems you would find in the mortgage industry or elsewhere that are really groundbreaking in overcoming the old collateral requirements that you put forward that are such an impediment for most young startup founders. So great to hear. As a candid question, do you need to provide any government guarantees, any backstopping to the banks, or are they accepting that this new model of credit scoring is actually reliable enough and passes their risk management provisions?
So great question. So we don't put any guarantees. No. But what we did was when we introduced the credit system, Stephen, they basically did not take 100% as it is. Of course, their risk assessment team, every bank adjust the scoring system a little bit to fit their system. So no bank guarantee, but assessment through these multidimensional, the 4 dimensions they're looking at, through that they assess through their system with our credit scoring scheme, and then they will grant the loans to the company directly without our intervention. But we and PwC, the idea, the beautiful part of that is Apex led it, ICTA, and the PwC came to define the scoring. So that is a huge acceptance in the bank, because it's not like something you found on a book or something. It works for this environment, it works for our culture, it works for the startup, technology startup. So that's how it was introduced. So there's no bank guarantee or any government guarantee we give today. No, it is not required. That's not the idea.
That's impressive. And Anura, we shall be watching how the alternative credit framework is developing. You're breaking new ground, and I bet this is of huge interest for other younger ecosystems that are looking for alternative funding instruments. So thank you so much for sharing that. We are nearly approaching the end of our Candid Conversation interview, but if you would look at our international audience, investors, talent, founders, why should they come to Sri Lanka? What would be the most important things to look at?
So I think simply, Stephen, if I give 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, of course, we are a small nation, but we are very focused. Now, if you look at, like I said, if you really look at the London Stock Exchange product was built in Sri Lanka or maintained in Sri Lanka today. Pearson higher education, like I was leading earlier, the products are built in Sri Lanka, right? The IFS financial system, the innovation center in Sri Lanka. So what is the reason they all these MNCs, 3 examples, like even Wiley recently came, Wiley Education USA, another publicly listed company in Sri Lanka. So what are the reasons why they are coming to Sri Lanka? It's simply because they understand the talent pool here. We have a very, of course, a small, like approximately 200,000 skilled workforce in technology, but we have developed products to the global market, solid, sound products. And that's one reason. And the proof is these companies, right? Secondly, that the government is very friendly to develop the ecosystem, whether it's a startup or whether it's MNC or whether it's export oriented. So we have a friendly regulations, rules that we are implementing. Number three, the latest development is the digital laws that we are putting in place, which is the Data Protection Act, for example, which is waiting for the final parliament voting, which brings probably GDPR equivalent protection to those companies do business with Sri Lanka. So that aspect alone shows, Stephen, not only the government regulations, ease of regulations doing business, plus the MNCs already in building global products, but also further with the digital law we enhance and we are strengthening. I'm very proud to say in the regionally, we are ahead of many other neighbor countries. So these three reasons, I think, is more than enough any investor, any MNC to believe why they should pick Sri Lanka. And also we are bringing the technoparks community. There are 5 technoparks we are bringing now, multi facilities that also give lot of facilities for this company to come and settle here with lot of offers.
Right, if I summarize, a highly conducive and highly organized government initiative, really ambitious. You made a point going from 1 billion to 5 billion as a broad development, digital transformation development across nationwide really. Large, deep talent pools, affordable talent, highly experienced talent. You just mentioned it in the startup environment, but also in a more traditional corporate environment, but coming from a digital skills perspective, certainly a great asset. And I think to the beginning of our conversation, you made a really interesting point that you are investing in digital transformation and new concepts and innovation in what many may see as traditional sectors, agriculture, tourism, hospitality, etc. All these niches that are now coming up and that are now following the digital revolution that we've seen elsewhere, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So hugely interesting, the areas of focus that you are pursuing. Anura, thank you very much for the opportunity to hear from you and what you're doing and your ambitions for Sri Lanka. Congratulations to what you've already put in place. And we will be looking with great interest how the Sri Lankan startup ecosystem develops, in particularly, and this might be really interesting for our international audience in similar markets, how the alternative lending instrument is progressing. Congratulations for having put it in place and for acting so decisively in addressing the seed stage, the early stage funding gaps that we all clearly saw last year. It's incredible. 6 months later, you got a solution that is so interesting and something to others may wish to learn from. Thank you very much, Anura, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And Startup Genome, a huge thank wholeheartedly, coming from industry now to stateside for the last less than 1 year. I see how much of work you guys are doing and helping entire global startups. So huge thank for the meritorious work and then the great work you do. Thank you so much, Stephen. It was very nice talking to you.
Thank you. It was an honor supporting you. Thank you very much, Anura.